So the next area of concern for the assessors, as well as for us as the university, and for me as administrator in particular, of course, is the whole area of procurement and supply chain management. So what is the problem here? Firstly, the ambition with having in place a procurement and supply chain management system, process, and colleagues to transact it is so that we are able to get the right quality of goods and services at the right price. That is, at a competitive price. And ideally, right quality and best price is what we are aiming for. You can imagine if a situation arises where, as we have seen far too often in our public sector here in South Africa and in public administration, that a toilet roll can cost up to 3 or 4 times what it should cost, that a tea bag can cost up to 3 to 4 times what it should cost. So you can imagine the purchase of a microscope, already expensive as it is, what it could go for if we do not have in place proper controls and accountability in our supply chain and procurement processes. And so the purchase of a desk, the purchase of a lab desk, the purchase of a chair, the purchase of software. You can go down the list of items that the university procures. The supply of beds for student accommodation, the building of facilities for the university. And I'm simply going to combine then in this conversation 2 of these key concerns then. On the one hand, supply chain and procurement, and on the other, infrastructure and new build in the institution, because they're closely interlinked as well. Many of you will recall that when the university put out a procurement note or a tender note to build a new applied and computer science building or life sciences building, the university went through the tender process, appointed a tenderer, and the tenderer then took occupation, and a few days later was thrown out as the local community, others will say, as crime syndicates then sought to take over the site and were demanding 25% share in the project. So you can imagine the chaos that that has caused in and of itself. But imagine the chaos that is caused when we enter into a contractual relationship with a party. And when we expect that party to meet its obligations, we then go to the contract and key parts of that contract is missing. Can you imagine a situation in which we go out to procure the services, for argument's sake, of a service provider who will provide for us protection services? Can you imagine a circumstance in which documents go missing, where competitive bidders and bids are put forward, let's say 15 such bids, and that somehow or another the bidder who presumably has the best proposal or tender finds that some of their documents go missing and that some of their information is leaked to another tenderer? This is what we found. So the circumstance that we have had here and that we're seeking to cauterize from the roots of the disease is precisely this in the area of procurement and supply chain management and the procurement of infrastructure projects. Number 1, the disappearance of documents. Number 2, the putting in place of an electronic document management system with controls in place as to who has access and under which circumstances do people have access to these documents. Consider an example last year when we were finalizing the appointment of a tenderer for the provision of the university's protection services. This is a tender worth probably 400 million rands over a 5-year period, if not more. And so you can imagine the stakes are very high, because presumably the profit margins are also high. A computer gets lost. A computer with all of the information and the records of all of the committees that had been held, the bid spec committee, the bid award committee, a second round of a bid spec committee and a bid award committee, and possibly even a third round of a spec committee and a board committee. So the minutes get lost. And somehow it finds its way to an unsuccessful tenderer, as it has happened. This is no story that I'm telling you. And suddenly the university finds itself in court, with this unsuccessful tenderer having access to what they call a whistleblower. Damn, no whistleblower here. It was actually a looted, stolen computer and documents harvested from that computer. We have suspended the individual concerned who allegedly lost this computer. It turns out this was not lost, because it was not stolen, for that matter, because there was no forced entry into the vehicle of the member of staff concerned. So there is a disciplinary process in place. Another example, a memory stick with important information is lost by another colleague. Again, supply chain, sensitive supply chain management information. The consequence of that is that a process that had taken us 6 months up to that point to appoint a successful tenderer had to be scrapped and restarted, slowing down the institution's ability to provide the services that it is expected to provide on time and to the right quality. And so a completely rotten procurement system and supply chain management system we found in the institution. And I can assure you that despite the measures that we have put in place, such as a new policy, such as a new procurement practice note, and I'll explain that in a moment, that the syndicates are still at work, working hard, trying to influence colleagues, offering them hundreds of thousands of rands to gain access to information, so that that information gives them an advantage in the tender process. Or if they did not get the tender, so that they could take us to court on some flimsy grounds. And so we've got to be vigilant as council, as executive management, as senior management, as students and staff of the university, in respect of this reality that we're experiencing, of syndicates seeking to access the university's procurement and tender and supply chain management processes in order for gain for themselves. And so what have we done? We have put in place, as I've referred a moment ago to, at the very beginning of the administration period, a new procurement practice note. We found, in addition to what I've shared already, we found also that procurement had been devolved in the institution. So up to a certain level of procuring goods and services, individuals in the various departments of the university, academic and professional support, could pick up the phone a few friends, can you give me a quote for the supply of this good or that service, and then award it themselves, that particular tender to an individual. And so that had to be stopped. We had to centralize. There's of course been a consequence in that the process has slowed down a little bit. But it cannot be the case that I, as a supervisor or a manager, has the authority to make a few phone calls and then award the tender myself. And so we had to separate these two functions. The procurement of bids or quotations or tenders, separate, undertaken in a revamped procurement and supply chain management team. And then the determination, in partnership with the colleagues who want that service or good, through a, if it is above a certain threshold, through a bid evaluation committee and through a bid award committee to make those awards. And if needs be, for Mancom to sign off on those awards when they trigger or click over the delegated authority of the bid awards committee. And therefore, a range of measures and revisions of our policy. The policy also now provides that where a supplier has been found to have corruptly received or won, quote unquote, a bid or award or a contract or a tender of the institution, that we would summarily, bring to an end that contract, and we would blacklist that company as well, and make sure that they do not get business in the public procurement system of the country equally so. Where a company has also received a contract corruptly, that we would make every effort to get the institution's money back from that particular company. So a range of measures then in place from the back end, if you like, the office end, how we source quotes and how we award these bids, across to how we specify a tender through a bid spec committee, through to how we put it out for tender, through to how those tenders are evaluated by an independent bid evaluation committee comprising of independent colleagues from outside the university who are regularly rotated, across to the bid award committee. All these measures then are in place to achieve for the university the best outcome in terms of the goods and services it is seeking, in terms of quality and in terms of price and in terms of the timely delivery of those goods and services. And so a lot of cleanup has been undertaken, and more still needs to be done in the area of procurement and supply chain management, and in the procurement of large infrastructure projects for the institution. But I'm confident with these measures now in place that the university would achieve its objective: value for money at the right time, given its needs for those goods and services. And I'm absolutely confident that Council and the Vice-Chancellor coming in and the Executive Management, Senior Management can rely fully on this process. Of course, this process would be audited, both by in particular, shall I say, by the internal auditors from time to time, to make sure that that the controls are in place and that they are effective, and that we are fully complying with the university's policies and procurement notes, practice notes, and guidelines. I turn next to an area of grave concern for the institution, and that is the matter of staffing in the institution. By this I refer to the entire value chain of a vacancy arising in the institution, an advert being placed for that position, a shortlisting committee being appointed or a selection panel being appointed, the panel interviewing the candidates who they have so shortlisted, through to the appointment process. This entire process, of course, depends again on a set of controls being in place and those controls being effective. The system can easily break down, for example, when a position is advertised for which there is no place on the staffing structure. It can also break down when we appoint a person who does not meet the requirements of the qualification. What we have found, following a deep dive, as you wish, a deep assessment by our internal auditors, is frightening. More than 200 colleagues in the institution have been appointed outside of the institution's policies and rules. So, let's go through what we have found. Firstly, we have found that the institution had no controls in place at the level of its human resources management executive, and therefore of the MANCOM, or executive management, and the Vice-Chancellor, nor of Council, to control the appointment of staff to the institution. In fact, we had a situation in which heads of departments, supervisors, could simply create a post and advertise the post, mostly internally and less so externally, put together their own selection panels and make the appointment. And so the entire process breaks down. What we've found is at least 3 points of breakdown. Number one, we found posts were advertised for which there was no position on the staffing structure. Number two, staff were appointed on a temporary basis outside of the procedure of the university, and then 3 months later converted to permanent appointments. Again, outside of the policies and procedures of the institution. Number three, what we found is that a number of members of staff were appointed without meeting the requirements of that post, whether it is the necessary experience nor the qualifications. And so I sit with a list of over 200 members of staff who have found their way into the institution, probably not because of their effort, but because of the effort of colleagues who perhaps thought this was the right thing to do, or who were simply corrupt in appointing relatives and friends rather than taking the interests of the institution at heart and placing it first. And so I've asked for legal advice on what are our options in these circumstances. Do we tackle the supervisors and other colleagues who have made these appointments? Do we tackle the 200 plus members of staff who now occupy positions, often despite not meeting the requirements of that role? And these appointments are rife across the institution. They're at post level 5 all the way to post level 16. And so this is a troubling situation for the institution. What is the outcome of this? The outcome is that the institution has grown by over 200 members of staff outside of its staff establishment. And you can imagine the consequences of this. 5 years ago, when the institution had a surplus of about 500 million rands, that is a reserve of 500 million rands, that reserve has gone to waste within the space of 3 years. Principally, not only, but principally because staff were appointed outside of the staff establishment without reference to the budget of the institution. And so the institution has gone into deficit. And by the time I arrived as administrator, we had found ourselves in a situation where we had to freeze 150 million rands worth of posts, because now the penny had dropped. The chickens had come home to roost, so to speak. And the upshot was that we were 150 million rands annually in the deep. And whereas previously we had 450, 500 million rands of reserves, we now had no more reserves in order to finance these excess positions. And so we've undertaken a number of actions in this regard. Number one, we undertook an organizational refinement exercise. I referred to this in the earlier conversation, in which we reviewed the academic head's staffing structure. We reviewed the post-level 1 to 4 staffing structure, and we took out posts and costs to the tune of 40 million rands, without damaging by any means the institution's leadership and executive management capability to steward the institution into the next period. So that was post-levels 1 to 5. We subsequently initiated for post-levels 6 to 9 and further on to 16 a similar refinement, organizational review and refinement exercise. And as you can imagine, it's going to lead us to possibly 200 excess staff in the institution as we speak. And so we expect to conclude that exercise before the end of the administration period. It's a very weighty matter. It's a difficult matter. It's a challenging matter. It's a complex matter. But it's unavoidable. We have to face up to the consequences of this review and organizational refinement process. Of course, we are determined to save as many jobs as possible in the institution. And I can assure you that this process will be undertaken carefully and sensitively, obviously also recognizing the employment laws and other labor laws of our nation, and we will undertake it in an Ubuntu, a manner, meaning in a compassionate and in a caring manner for all of our staff. But it's clear the situation cannot continue. What we've also done is to pull the controls away, that is the appointment of staff, away from supervisory levels, shall I say the creation of posts and the filling of posts. We've pulled them back into the division for human resources, from where, again as we've done with procurement and supply chain management, we are now controlling and stewarding the process, in this instance, of vacancy creation, of advertising posts, of going through the processes of interviewing and of making appointments to those positions. But as you can imagine, we have had to freeze so many posts, in particular, sadly, in the academic domain. And it's the academic domain that will in particular receive our attention for immediate relief, based again on the resources that the institution has available. Just on resources, the reality is that the institution is still in deep financial troubles. And this, unfortunately, has to do with this combination of staffing issues that I've described, and in an earlier segment, the procurement and supply chain management issues. Those are the two principal reasons for why we find ourselves in the situation. The absence of controls, and where there were controls, the ineffectiveness of those controls to enable the university to achieve, on the one hand, its ambitions, and on the other hand, a balanced budget with no operating loss. So, much work then still to be done in this domain of staffing. And again, I should note that we have filled the vacant posts of Executive Director, Human Resources, with Mr. Peter Morris, a seasoned human resources expert. And again, we wish him, senior management and the Executive Management Council well as you begin, continue, shall I say, to reset the institution in respect of its staffing requirements to give effect to its mission, its goals, its strategic plan, and to its annual performance plans. We next turn to another area of major breakdown and institutional risk, and that is the issue of the provision of student residence places and the upkeep of these places. And so there are two parts to this conversation. The first, the university's own accommodation, and secondly, privately owned accommodation. Let's speak first about university owned. As I've shared with you previously, the big concern that faces us here is to be able to upkeep our residences to the highest standards. In order to do that, we procure goods and services. Services such as small works, so if there is a burst water pipe or sewage pipe, if there are leaks from a bathroom or shower into the rest of the residence, just picking on those by way of example, we require the services of service providers. Equally so when we procure the goods, from beds to mattresses, and all of the items that we require for this purpose. It's important for us to make sure that we get the value for money that we should get, and we get this delivered on time. It is clear that the corrupt or the rotten practices in procurement and supply chain management would work their way eventually through to even these services. And that's unfortunately what we found right at the outset. In a number of residences where there had been leaks out of the bathrooms and toilets into the halls and into rooms of students, the university established that these were the result of old infrastructure, more than 50 years infrastructure, and therefore the pipes themselves experience erosion and breakdown. That meant that the university had to procure services and goods in order to remediate that situation. What we found was something else. Instead of replacing these pipes in the walls, that is, removing them and replacing them with good and high quality piping and with the right size of piping, none of this happened. These were opened and then plastered over, only 3 months later for the leaks again to reappear. And so what we have here is collusion between, on the one hand, a colleague in the institution, a fellow member of staff, who procures these services in the manner that I described earlier, appointing their own preferred providers, service providers, rather than the institution taking a look at it. These are devolved and decentralized with no controls in place. At the same time, the colleagues who then procure these services corruptly or improperly are the ones who oversee the service providers or the contracts who deliver the goods or the works. And they tick the box, the work has been done. And this is how a system, a syndicate operates, a collusion system operates. And the consequence is that the university had spent millions of rands on these works, 32 million rands at the last count. It then had to restart those work with properly appointed and capable and not corrupt service providers. And so you can imagine the frustration among students about this situation. And so the university is currently aiming within its new procurement policy and practice notes and within the new regime that we have put in place of accountability for performance within the team responsible for operations and logistics. We have put in place new measures to make sure that we can make progress towards providing a high quality experience for our students. Now, the university also, like other universities, accredit and procure beds on top of what it is able to provide. So the university is only able, for example, to provide short of 2,000 beds. It has to procure an additional 8,000 to 10,000 beds in order to meet the demand for accommodation from students who attend the university. How does the university do this? It goes out, in terms of national policy and regulations, goes out to tender. Puts out a tender. Individuals put up their hand. The university goes and accredits those facilities, meaning they meet, in terms of national policy, the guidelines in terms of the quality of experience for students, because we know that learning and living conditions are important for our students to achieve the progress that we expect of them. That is to complete their qualification on time, rather than in on time plus 1, plus 2, plus 3 years. And so it's well acknowledged that learning and living conditions play a key role in student success. So, the university, we found, had entered into contractual relationships with a range of providers to provide these beds, and another set of providers who the university had accredited rather than entered into a contractual relationship with. This we found odd. Certainly in my role as the ministerial committee chair a decade ago to look into student accommodation, I had learnt and advised the minister on the importance of accreditation and of setting accreditation standards, and for these providers to enter into agreements with students rather than universities. And so it was a major wrestling match as we began this process of unraveling these arrangements. And so by the end of this year, the university will have exited all of these contractual arrangements and will default to an accreditation system. So we will accredit student accommodation in terms of our and the national standards, and students will choose a provider based on the list of accredited providers. They will enter into a contractual obligation with those providers, and they will authorize the payment to those providers, rather than the current arrangement where the university has a contractual relationship and obligation with these parties concerned. And so that is a major shift that the university is making, mindful of the importance of these providers having some confidence that indeed their services will be fully, or at least well, used by the university's students. And so as we look ahead then, we will revise that relationship with these providers. Simultaneously, going back to council, the university had engaged in a tender process to procure beds for itself, owned by itself. Regrettably, this became a major breakdown point in council, as warring factions in council competed against each other, one arguing that instead of the state's 230 million rands and the university's 100 million rands going towards procuring beds from an existing provider, this should go towards building new beds. And the other faction arguing that these beds that the successful tenderer was providing, and we're speaking here of Academia Student Village, that those beds were high quality and were coming at a significant discount. 1,826 beds, you can make the calculation for yourself, today would cost anything between 250,000 and 300,000 rand a bed to build. The tenderer was offering the university at 200,000 rands a bed and a much higher quality to the university's own beds. In fact, on a rating scale of 5, those beds are rated 4, and the university's beds overall rated between a 1 and a 2, just to give a sense of perspective. So much work to be done to get the university's beds at least to a level 3 out of 5. And so the university's relevant committees didn't quote it, the council itself didn't quote it. And one of the big breakdown factors then for council, collapsing in a heap, was its failure to finalize this procurement. And so one of the first measures that I had to take was to go through the due diligence undertaken by the university in that tender process, examine in detail and make a determination as administrator as to whether to proceed and whether to advise the Department of Higher Education that this would be money well spent of the national state in this resource. In the end, after the due diligence exercise of my own, I made the decision that the university would proceed to procure these beds, Academia Student Village, and now they're part of the university stock of beds, and the department's contribution to this purchase from state coffers was in the end 250 million rands. The university's contribution 110 million rands, 370 million rands we therefore have expended on the purchase of these 1,826 beds. So an excellent purchase for the institution, and it means that the institution is able to provide an excellent learning and living experience for students who occupy those beds, far better than we are providing in our previously owned beds or currently owned beds. And at the same time, the university is able to make a reasonable income per bed as a contribution to its own operating costs as well. And so this matter then of learning and living, privately owned and institution-owned accommodations, therefore received significant attention, and it must continue to receive attention. One of the areas, for example, that I was puzzled at not having been put under the microscope of our internal auditors was the issue of whether in fact the students who registered at the beginning and then entered that accommodation were still there at the end of the first semester, were still there at the end of the year, and whether indeed the university had been properly invoiced for those beds. So a big concern still that requires its own attention. And I'm certain that the internal auditors would be asked to apply their minds and undertake a forensic and a detailed audit into whether indeed we have been invoiced properly over the last 3 years or so. So important issues, and important not only for our students but also for their academic program and for the success of our university. And so then we turn to the areas that have presented themselves as areas of some weakness and great risk, and in some instances lacking effective controls in the academic administration and in the academic program of the institution. And so I give attention and ask for us to reflect then on a range of interconnected matters. Number one, the entire student experience chain in the institution, from application stage through to admission and access to the institution, through to their progression, through to their graduation. That's the one part. The second part of that conversation is about the program and qualification mix, the extended programs, and enrollment management in the institution. Let's reflect on these. It is self-evident that if there is weakness in the admission process of an institution, meaning we admit students who don't qualify for admission, then we're going to have major problems. Not only in the fact that we had admitted students who do not meet the requirement, and therefore we break the law of the country, but number two, we will see students who do not, on average, meet the requirements not being successful in the institution. And so the university invests teaching and teaching time, accommodation, student accommodation, a whole range of services to students who do not meet the requirement and students who are not successful in the end. And so what we have found and observed is because the university did not have in place an online registration process, we had a range of individuals, ex-student leaders, ex-students, acting as runners, acting as go-betweens between students at the end of the queue and academics and other staff from the registrar's side who are responsible for admission. And again, we have here a syndicate operating. And we have seen examples where a student pays 2,000 rands, not meeting the admission requirements, but finding themselves admitted. And that 2,000 rand is spent on that value chain between the runners or the intermediaries and the sadly corrupt colleague who then facilitates their admission. And so you can imagine the impact on our reputation of this kind of failure and weakness. You can imagine also if we don't have controls, or if those controls are not effective in terms of recording students' progression in the institution, their completion of modules. And if it is a case that we have incorrect information entered into the system, incorrect assessment scores, students get promoted as having completed a course, when in fact they've not completed a course. They graduate not having been successful in a number of modules along the line. You can again see the impact, dramatic impact, on the university's reputation. And again, the university is breaking the law in respect of not complying with the basic requirements of ensuring admissions are in line with the university's rules and with the national legislation and rules and regulations. And on the other hand, its graduates fall foul of the very same rules and regulations. We are fortunate that ours had not ballooned, as it has at University of Zululand and sometimes University of KwaZulu-Natal and a few other universities, to the extent that it has. And so this is a major weakness and a major concern then that we are also remediating, and a number of measures have been put in place. The chief of these has been to put in place an online registration system, which we piloted in the second semester of last year, 2020, and successfully implemented in the first semester of 2021. Of course, we're going to have to make sure that our auditors, from time to time, again check on the controls that are in place and their effectiveness to ensure the validity, to ensure the reliability of the processes that underpin admission, succession or progression, and graduation in the institution. The second part of this conversation is about the university's falling enrollment. And there are a number of issues in play here. Number one, it relates to the effectiveness of our enrollment management, and I'll speak to that in a moment. Number two, it relates to the availability of excellent extended curriculum programs. And number three, they relate to our program and qualification mix. Let's begin with the last one first. Our PQM, as we call it. Our PQM is designed in line with our mission as a University of Technology. So much so that enrollment is balanced heavily in favor of two of our four faculties, engineering and technology and applied and computer sciences. For good reason. We are a University of Technology. Up until 3 years ago, the balance of our enrollment mix between these two on the one hand and management and human sciences on the other was 60%, 65% enrollment in the first two and 35% enrollment in human and management sciences, for good reason. Unfortunately, that has turned, and dramatically so that it's now the other way around. 40% enrolled in engineering and technology and applied computer sciences, and and 60% in management and human sciences. Now, of course, it's unfair to simply paint these faculties with the same brush. We appreciate that even within those faculties there are vocational and career professional programs on offer, and we have no doubt that enrollment in those should be high. Logistics and logistics management, transportation management, by way of example, come to mind. A whole range of programs, legal services, and photography, design, art come to mind in the Faculty of Human Sciences. But overall, it cannot be the case that we have this balance. A major reason for this imbalance has been our failure to put in place extended curriculum programs to enable access into those engineering, technology, and applied and computer science programs. What are extended curriculum programs? These are typically programs designed for a 4-year rather than a 3-year normal stream. This is in order to enable students who just meet the requirements for that qualification entry to have additional time, and the curriculum is packaged or structured in a manner to enable them to go at their pace and to complete the program in 4 rather than 3 years of the so-called mainstream program. There is a second reason for us not meeting our enrollment targets in engineering, technology, and applied and computer sciences. And it's an area that I've drawn to the attention vociferously so, robustly so, to Professor Linnington, our Deputy VC, for Teaching, Learning and Student Services, and she is seized with the matter. Both of these, by the way, the extended curriculum programs on the one hand and getting those in place, and number two, the issue that I now want to address. What then are the causes for this big shift that we have seen in enrollment in the institution? There are at least two issues that should preoccupy us here, and urgently so. The first of these is the widened application and introduction of extended curricular programs. Not only should that be a concern for us, it is also the admission requirements into these extended curriculum programs. It cannot be that we have the same entrance requirement for an extended curriculum program as for a mainstream or traditional stream program. And so that must require our attention. The second part of this is our overall admission requirements into engineering technology and into applied and computer sciences programs. First of all, let's be aware and remind ourselves that the output of science, physical sciences, and mathematics graduates from our public schooling system is low and weak. It means that we are competing with universities ranging from University of Cape Town and Pretoria and Stellenbosch and Johannesburg and KwaZulu-Natal and so on and so forth, across to universities such as Central University of Technology, Tshwane University of Technology, not far from us, UNISA for that matter. We are competing with Durban University of Technology, with Cape Provincial University of Technology. We're competing with Nelson Mandela University, another comprehensive university. We're competing with all of these universities which, as things stand, are rated far higher than us in reputation stakes in the country. It does mean that students are going to choose those universities first than us. But most strikingly is the case that if one just looks at our admission requirements for any program, in mining, by way of example, metallurgy, mining engineering, just pick on those two. And you now look at the admission requirements at the University of Johannesburg, which is a higher rated institution and higher ranked institution, both in the public mind and by other academics. We find that our admission requirements are higher than that of the University of Johannesburg. Now, goodness me, how on earth are we going to be able to attract students into our university when our requirements are far higher? It simply does not add up. It does not make sense. And so these are two matters that I have placed firmly and robustly on the agenda of Senate, of Senex, of the executive management, of the deans, and of the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, our Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Teaching, Learning and Student Services, Professor Linnington. And I'm hoping that come January next year, that these issues would have been resolved and the university would be in a far better place to be able to meet its enrollment targets, in particular, so in engineering and technology and in applied and computer sciences. Finally, back to the PQM, or the program qualification mix. It is self-evident if the university offers programs that we offered 50 years ago, as if nothing has changed, then we're going to find ourselves in deep trouble. Because students follow the market. They understand the market better than perhaps we do inside our universities. And so students have a fairly good idea as to which are the scarce skills programs, career and vocational and professional programs, by way of example. If we don't offer those programs, if we are also not futuristic, thinking ahead about Fourth Industrial Revolution, Fifth Industrial Revolution, Sixth Industrial Revolution, if we don't reflect on our environment right here in the Vaal, where things have changed fundamentally and fundamentally so, where demand for jobs in the iron and steel industry has really struggled, has really been falling more than stable, where jobs in the neighboring industries are simply no longer available in the kind, the type and the scale that they were 10 years ago, then we're going to find ourselves struggling to meet our enrollment targets. Then we're going to be offering programs that are of no use. And of course, I'm saying this carefully because I'm speaking in particular about engineering technology and applied and computer sciences. We are a university of technology. We have a mission and a mandate. We have a strategic plan that gives effect to that. We have annual performance plans that reflect the annual slices of that strategic plan. And so going forward, these are important issues for the institution, ranging from how we admit students, how we progress students, how we graduate students, and the controls and the effectiveness of the controls there, because these impact our reputation amongst employers, amongst future students, amongst schools and parents, in our community more generally, and our region, our continent for that matter. Across to how we review and constantly refine our program qualification mix, how we constantly review and refine our offerings in respect of extended curriculum programs, and how we refine on a regular basis our admission criteria. These are all issues that must preoccupy us as we continue to reset and rebuild our university. And again, I wish our executive management, our deans, our senior managers, and of course under the stewardship of our future incoming Vice Chancellor and of Council, and our individual academics and staff and students. I just want to wish you all the best. I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic that we have invested in the right areas over the last 2 years in order to enable the institution to press forward confidently so, and to avoid another administration period, certainly for the next decade. And so I wish you well and all the best on this very important journey of nurturing for our nation fine and outstanding graduates who will build our economies, build our societies, build our nations here in South Africa, across our region and across our world. So thank you very much for this opportunity. It's been a great honor and a great privilege. Challenging, yes. At times painful, yes. But it's been a great honor to contribute to helping reset the university. And again, I wish you only the best in the years and decades ahead. Thank you.